There's a place in France where the ground is still poisoned 100 years later, where nothing grows, where you can't dig without finding human bones. And in 1916, 2 million men fought there for 10 months over a few miles of dirt. Verdun, February 21st, 1916 to December 18th, 1916. 300 days of continuous fighting. The longest battle in human history. When people talk about World War I, they mention the Somme, they mention Passchendaele, but Verdun was something different. It was hell on earth. And the reason it happened, the way it was fought, and what it did to the men who survived, that's a story most people don't really know. Here's the problem with how we learn about Verdun. We get the basic facts, we hear it was long and bloody, we see the casualty numbers, roughly 300,000 dead and another 450,000 wounded, 750,000 casualties total. But numbers don't tell you what it was really. Numbers don't explain why generals kept feeding men into a meat grinder for 10 months. Numbers don't show you what happened to human beings in that hellscape. So, let's actually understand what Verdun was. Why it started, how it was fought, and why it became a symbol of everything terrible about World War I. By early 1916, the Western Front had been stuck in the same place for over a year. Trenches stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland. Neither side could break through. Attacks would gain a few hundred meters at the cost of thousands of lives, and then the other side would counterattack and push them back. The war had become a stalemate, and both sides were looking for a way to break it. The German chief of staff was a man named Erich von Falkenhayn. He had a plan, and it was brutal in its logic. He didn't think Germany could actually break through the French lines. The defenses were too strong, the machine guns were too effective, the artillery, would destroy any attacking force before it got far. But he realized he didn't need to break through. He just needed to bleed France dry. If Germany could kill enough French soldiers, France would have to surrender or make peace. The French army would simply run out of men willing to fight. This was a new kind of strategic thinking. Previous wars had been about capturing territory or destroying enemy armies in decisive battles. Falkenhayn was thinking about attrition on a national scale. He was calculating how many casualties France could sustain before their society collapsed. He was planning to murder an entire generation of French men and break France's will to fight. Falkenhayn chose Verdun for specific reasons. Verdun was a fortress city in northeastern France. It had protected France from invasions for centuries. Roman armies had fought there. Medieval sieges had happened there. In 1792, during the French Revolution, Verdun had held against Prussian invaders. It was woven into French history and French identity. It sat in a salient, which means it stuck out into German-held territory like a bulge. The Germans could attack it from 3 sides: north, east, and south. This meant they could bring overwhelming force to bear while the French would have difficulty bringing in reinforcements and supplies. And here's the key: Verdun was symbolic. It meant something to France. The fortifications around Verdun were considered the strongest in France. They represented French military power and French determination. The French would defend it no matter what. They couldn't let Germany take it without looking weak. Falkenhayn understood this psychology perfectly. He knew France would feed men into Verdun to defend it, and that's exactly what he wanted. Falkenhayn's plan was simple and horrible. Attack Verdun, force France to defend it, use superior German artillery to kill as many French soldiers as possible, make the casualty ratio favor. Germany killed 2 or 3 Frenchmen for every German lost. Continue this for as long as necessary until France had no more soldiers to send. He called it bleeding France white. He wasn't trying to capture Verdun, not really. The capture would be a bonus, but it wasn't the goal. He was using it as bait. A killing ground where France would send army after army to be destroyed. The German military started preparing for the attack in late 1915. They brought in over 1,000 artillery pieces. Everything from small field guns to massive 420mm siege howitzers that fired shells weighing nearly a ton each. They stockpiled millions of shells. They built new railway lines to bring supplies forward. They constructed observation posts and command bunkers. They trained their infantry in new tactics designed to take advantage of the artillery bombardment. Everything was planned meticulously. The attack began on February 21st, 1916, at 7:15 in the morning. The Germans started with the most intense artillery bombardment the world had ever seen. Over 1,000 artillery pieces opened fire at once. Guns of every size, field guns, heavy guns, massive siege guns that fired shells the size of small cars. They fired on a front about 8 miles wide and several miles deep, targeting French trenches, bunkers, supply routes, and observation posts. The bombardment lasted 9 hours. 9 straight hours of shells falling on French positions. Imagine that. you're sitting in a trench or a bunker, and for 9 hours without stopping, the world is exploding around you. The noise alone was enough to drive men insane. Soldiers described it as a continuous roar that made it impossible to think. The ground shook constantly like an earthquake. Trees were blown to splinters. Trenches collapsed, burying men alive. Bunkers that were supposed to be shell-proof were hit over and over until the concrete cracked and broke apart. French soldiers who survived described the bombardment as apocalyptic. They said the sky was black with smoke. They couldn't see more than a few meters through the dust and debris. They couldn't communicate because the noise drowned out everything. Hand signals were useless because you couldn't see anything. Men just huddled in whatever cover they could find and prayed the next shell wouldn't land on them. Some French positions simply ceased to exist. A trench line would be there 1 minute, and after an hour of bombardment there'd be nothing but overlapping craters. The men who had been in those trenches were gone. Not just killed, but obliterated. There was nothing left of them to bury. They had been vaporized by high explosive or buried so deep under collapsed earth that their bodies would never be found. The French forces around Verdun weren't expecting this. French intelligence had some warnings that an attack was coming, but the French high command didn't believe Verdun was in serious danger. They thought the main German effort would come somewhere else. The fortifications around Verdun had been stripped of troops and guns to send to other parts of the front. The French command had decided that modern warfare was about trenches and machine guns, not old stone forts. So they'd taken the guns out of the forts and reduced the garrisons to skeleton crews. This was a catastrophic mistake. There were only about 30,000 French soldiers defending the initial attack zone. The Germans had over 100,000 infantry ready to attack, supported by another 100,000 in reserve. The French were outnumbered 3-1 at the point of attack. Worse, they didn't have adequate artillery to respond to the German bombardment. They had some guns, but nothing like what the Germans had. When the bombardment started, French artillery tried to respond but was quickly overwhelmed and destroyed. When the bombardment finally stopped at 4:16 in the afternoon, German infantry advanced. They used new tactics, small groups of stormtroopers moving forward, using cover, bypassing strong points instead of attacking them head-on. These stormtroopers were elite infantry, specially trained and equipped. They carried lighter weapons, rifles, pistols, grenades, and some had flamethrowers. They moved fast and they were aggressive. The flamethrower was a terrifying new weapon. It shot a stream of burning liquid that could reach 30 or 40 meters. The psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers who saw flamethrowers coming would often panic and run. If you were caught in a bunker or trench when a flamethrower unit arrived, you had two choices: come out and surrender, or burn to death. The Germans used flamethrowers to clear French bunkers and strongpoints that had survived the bombardment. The French defenders who had survived the bombardment were stunned, wounded, and disorganized. Many had been buried by collapsed trenches and had to dig themselves out. Others were shell-shocked, sitting in craters unable to respond. Some positions had lost all their officers and NCOs, leaving ordinary soldiers without leadership. Communication lines had been destroyed, so different French units didn't know what was happening elsewhere. The defense was fragmented and confused. The Germans advanced several miles in the first few days. French positions collapsed. Entire units were surrounded and forced to surrender. The German advance was methodical and efficient. They'd bombardment a position, move forward, clear it with stormtroopers and flamethrowers, consolidate, and then move to the next position. The French couldn't stop them. One of the key French forts, Fort Douaumont, fell on February 25th, just 4 days into the battle. Douaumont was the largest and most powerful fort in the Verdun defensive system. It was a massive concrete structure built into a hill. With thick walls and deep underground passages, it had positions for multiple artillery pieces and machine guns. It was supposed to be impregnable. But it had been mostly stripped of its garrison and weapons as part of the French decision to focus on trench warfare instead of a fort defense. When German troops approached Fort Douaumont, they found it defended by fewer than 60 men, many of them support troops, not combat soldiers. The fort's artillery had been removed. Most of its ammunition stores were empty. The few defenders couldn't possibly hold a fort designed for a garrison of hundreds. A small group of German soldiers, some accounts say as few as 10 men, entered the fort through an unguarded entrance and found their way inside. They captured the handful of French defenders without much fight. The Germans had captured the strongest fort in the Verdun defensive system, and it had barely cost them any casualties. The fall of Fort Douaumont shocked France. This wasn't supposed to happen. Verdun was supposed to be as unbreakable. The fortifications were supposed to protect France, but now the Germans had taken the most important fort in less than a week of fighting. Panic spread through the French government and military command. Politicians demanded explanations. The press was in uproar. The French public was horrified. Some generals suggested abandoning Verdun entirely and retreating to a better defensive line. From a purely military perspective, this made sense. Verdun was an salient and difficult to defend. The Germans could attack from 3 sides. Supply lines were limited. It might be better to pull back to a straighter, stronger line that would be easier to hold. But that was politically impossible. Verdun was too important symbolically. France had to hold it. The French government appointed a new commander for the Verdun sector, General Philippe Pétain. Pétain was 59 years old and near the end of his career. He was different from most French generals. He had a reputation as a defensive specialist, and unusually for a French officer, he actually cared about his soldiers' lives. Most French generals believed in attacking no matter the cost. They thought that sufficient courage and determination could overcome any defensive position. They'd spent the first year and a half of the war launching attacks that gained nothing and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Pétain was more cautious. He understood that men had limits. He'd been arguing for years that the French army was wasting lives in pointless attacks. He believed in using artillery in defensive positions, not just throwing men at enemy machine guns. Now, he was in charge of defending the most important battlefield of the war, and he had the authority to do things his way. Pétain stabilized the situation. He organized supplies. He made sure troops had food, ammunition, and medical care. He improved the artillery coordination so French guns could respond more effectively to German attacks. He built up the defenses and made sure every position was properly manned and supplied. He visited frontline units personally, which was rare for a general of his rank. The soldiers could see that he understood what they were going through. Most importantly, Pétain created a system that would define the battle for both sides, the rotation system. Instead of keeping the same units in the line until they were destroyed, which was the normal practice, Pétain would rotate units in and out. A division would spend a week or 2 at Verdun, then get pulled back to rest and get replacements. Fresh divisions would rotate in to replace them. This meant more French units would experience Verdun, but no single unit would be destroyed completely. It spread the burden across the entire French army. This rotation system had psychological benefits. Soldiers knew they wouldn't be at Verdun forever. They had a date when they'd be pulled out. This gave them something to hold on to. They just had to survive until their rotation ended. It also meant that French units maintained their cohesion and effectiveness. They didn't get ground down to nothing like German units sometimes did. The French had one major advantage: a single road connecting Verdun to the rest of France. This road ran from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, about 40 miles. It was the only supply line. Everything the French army at Verdun needed came down this road: food, water, ammunition, weapons, replacements, mail, medical supplies, everything. If this road was cut, Verdun would fall. There were no alternatives. The railway lines had been destroyed or were under German artillery fire. This road was it. The French organized a massive transport system. They called the road La Voie Sacrée, the sacred way. Trucks ran day and night, moving in one direction on one side of the road and returning empty on the other side. At peak times, a truck passed every 14 seconds. Think about that logistics. Challenge. Thousands of trucks moving constantly, in all weather, under occasional German artillery fire, keeping Verdun supplied. The French assigned entire labor battalions just to maintain the road. Crews would fill in shell craters, repair damaged sections, replace destroyed bridges, clear wrecked vehicles. The road was never allowed to close. Traffic moved continuously for 10 months. Over 3,000 trucks were in constant use. The drivers worked around the clock in shifts. Some drivers were killed when German shells hit their trucks, but the system never stopped. The Germans tried to cut this road with artillery. They positioned guns to fire on sections of the road. They used aircraft to spot truck convoys and direct artillery fire onto them. But they never succeeded in closing the road for more than a few hours. The French would repair it immediately, and traffic would resume. If the sacred way had been cut permanently, Verdun would have fallen. The entire battle depended on keeping that one road open, and the French managed to do it through sheer determination and brilliant organization. Through March and April and May, the battle continued. The Germans attacked, the French counterattacked. Ground was taken and lost and taken again. Villages were destroyed so completely that they ceased to exist. Places that had been farming communities for centuries were turned into nothing but rubble and craters. Some villages lost every single building. After the war, some of these villages were never rebuilt. They're officially recognized as villages that died for France. The land where they stood is still too contaminated and dangerous for reconstruction. The landscape was transformed. Before the battle, the area around Verdun was farmland and forests, rolling hills with villages, fields, and woods. After months of shelling, it became a moonscape. Every tree was destroyed, not just cut down, but obliterated. The forests were replaced by fields of splintered stumps and shattered branches. Every building was rubble. Every field was covered with craters. The ground was nothing but shell craters overlapping each other. Some craters were 30 feet deep and 50 feet across. Rain filled them with water mixed with mud and blood and pieces of bodies. The dirt itself changed color. Before the battle, it was brown and fertile. After millions of shells had exploded, it turned gray and chalky from all the chemicals and pulverized stone. Nothing would grow in it. The explosion residue and the metal fragments made the soil toxic. Even today, over 100 years later, the soil around Verdun is contaminated. Farmers still occasionally plow up bones and unexploded shells. Soldiers on both sides lived in these conditions for days or weeks at a time. They couldn't dig proper trenches because the ground was just shattered rock and mud. Every time you tried to dig, you'd hit rock or old trenches or bodies, so soldiers would shelter in shell holes. When it rained, which was frequent, the holes would fill with water and mud up to their waists or chests. Men would stand in the mud for days, unable to sit or lie down. They'd lean against the walls of the crater trying to rest, but they couldn't really sleep because of the cold, the wet, and the constant danger. Their feet would rot from constant exposure to water, a condition called trench foot. The skin would turn white and start to peel off. The flesh underneath would become infected. If untreated, trench foot could lead to gangrene and amputation. Soldiers were supposed to change their socks regularly and dry their feet, but at Verdun this was often impossible. You couldn't take off your boots when you were standing in waist-deep water in a shell hole being shelled constantly. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Supply was difficult, so soldiers didn't always get their rations. When food did arrive, it was usually cold and unappetizing. Canned meat, hard biscuits, maybe some cold soup. Fresh food was almost impossible to get at the front. Water was rationed and tasted like chemicals because it had to be purified to make it safe to drink. The water came in containers that also carried gasoline or oil sometimes, so it would taste like petroleum. Sleep was almost impossible. Artillery fire continued day and night. Even when there wasn't an attack, shells were constantly falling. Random death from artillery was the norm. You could be sitting in your hole eating a piece of bread, and a shell would land 20 feet away and the shrapnel would kill you. Or it wouldn't, and you'd watch the man next to you die instead. There was no pattern, no way to predict it. Death was completely random. This randomness was psychologically devastating. You couldn't do anything to protect yourself except hide and hope. Bodies were everywhere. There was no way to bury all the dead. The ground was too hard to dig graves in there. It wasn't time, and new bodies appeared faster than old ones could be buried. Dead men would be incorporated into parapets and fortifications. When soldiers needed to build up the walls of a trench or shell hole for protection, they'd use whatever material was available: sandbags, timbers, and sometimes corpses. Bodies would be stacked like sandbags to create barriers. Soldiers would use corpses recovered during attacks. If you were moving across no man's land and you needed to stop and fire, you'd shelter behind a dead body if that's all that was available. When trenches collapsed from shelling, bodies that had been buried would be uncovered. After rain, hands and feet would stick up out of the mud where men had been buried in shell craters. You'd walk across a battlefield and step on soft ground that would turn out to be a buried corpse. The smell was unimaginable. Rotting flesh, poison gas, human waste, chemicals from explosives, the stench of unwashed men, all of it mixed together in a smell that penetrated everything. Soldiers wrote that you could never get the smell out of your uniform or your skin. Men who survived Verdun said years later they could still smell it sometimes, triggered by certain odors or memories. The smell got into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. You breathed it in constantly. You tasted it when you ate. There was no escaping it. Rats were everywhere. They fed on the corpses and grew huge. Soldiers would see rats the size of cats crawling over the dead. The rats were fat and fearless. They'd come into the trenches at night looking for food. If you had rations, you had to guard them carefully, or rats would steal them. At night, you could hear them moving around, squeaking and fighting over corpses. If you were wounded and couldn't move, the rats would start eating you before you were even dead. Multiple soldiers recorded this happening to wounded men who lay in no man's land for hours or days before. Anyone could reach them. There are accounts of men waking up to find rats eating their faces or hands. The rats would bite sleeping men, leaving infected wounds. Some soldiers developed an obsession with killing rats, spending any spare time hunting them, but there were too many. For every rat you killed, 10 more would appear. The rats were winning their own battle at Verdun, thriving on the abundance of corpses. The artillery fire at Verdun was constant and overwhelming. Both sides fired millions of shells. The French alone fired over 10 million artillery shells during the battle. The Germans fired even more. Some estimates suggest 20 million shells or higher. Think about what that means. Millions of explosions, millions of pieces of metal flying through the air. The air itself became dangerous. Shrapnel would fly for hundreds of meters. Even if a shell didn't hit you directly, the shrapnel could kill you from far away. The dirt at Verdun is still contaminated with metal, fragments. You can't walk through the forests there today without finding shrapnel. Every year, farmers and forestry workers find tons of metal fragments when they work the land. The soil is estimated to contain millions of tons of metal from unexploded shells and shrapnel. This metal contamination will last for centuries. Artillery killed more men at Verdun than anything else. Direct hits would simply make a man disappear. There'd be nothing left to bury. A large shell landing directly on a soldier would obliterate him completely. Not even fragments of bones would remain. His comrades would just see a flash and he'd be gone. Near misses would tear men apart with shrapnel. A shell landing 10 or 20 meters away would send out thousands of metal fragments traveling at high speed. These fragments would slice through flesh and bone like they were nothing. The blast waves from large shells could kill without leaving visible wounds. The pressure wave from a big explosion could rupture internal organs. Men would be found dead with no marks on them, killed by the pressure wave that ruptured their lungs, hearts, or brains. Sometimes groups of men in a bunker would all be found dead with no visible injuries after a large shell landed nearby. The pressure wave had traveled through the walls and killed them all. Shell shock became epidemic. This was what we now call PTSD, or combat stress reaction, but it was worse because nobody understood it. Men would start shaking uncontrollably and couldn't stop. They'd lose the ability to speak. Their voices would just stop working. They'd break down crying and screaming. They'd become catatonic, just sitting and staring at nothing, not responding to anything. Some would run away from the battle in blind panic, not knowing where they were going or what they were doing. Others would curl up in shell holes and refuse to move, even when ordered. The military didn't understand shell shock. Many officers thought these men were cowards or fakers who were trying to avoid combat. The military medical establishment initially didn't recognize it as a real condition. Some shell-shocked soldiers were executed for cowardice. The French army executed over 600 soldiers during World War I, many for desertion or cowardice that was probably actually shell shock. Others were sent back to the front immediately with threats of execution if they didn't fight. A few lucky ones were sent to psychiatric hospitals, but the treatments were primitive and often brutal. Treatment for shell shock included electric shocks applied to the body, supposedly to stimulate the nerves back to normal functioning. Cold water immersion, where patients would be dunked in ice-cold water. Isolation, where shell-shocked soldiers would be left alone in dark rooms for days. These treatments didn't work and often made things worse. Most shell-shocked soldiers never fully recovered. They'd spend the rest of their lives dealing with nightmares, flashbacks, and psychological damage. Many became alcoholics or drug addicts trying to cope. Some committed suicide years after the war ended, unable to live with their memories. The Germans used poison gas at Verdun. They'd fire shells containing phosgene or chlorine gas into French positions. The gas shells didn't explode with a loud bang, like high-explosive shells. They'd break open with a soft pop and release their gas. The gas would sink into trenches and shell holes. It was heavier than air, so it would pool in low spots where soldiers were sheltering. You couldn't see it coming with phosgene. It was colorless. The first sign would be men starting to cough. Men caught in gas attacks would choke to death, their lungs burning and filling with fluid. Phosgene was particularly nasty because it could take hours or days to kill. A soldier might breathe in phosgene and think he was fine, then 6 hours. Later, his lungs would start filling with fluid and he'd slowly drown. Chlorine gas caused immediate burning and choking. Men would tear at their throats trying to breathe. Their eyes would burn and they'd go temporarily blind. Gas masks provided some protection, but they were uncomfortable and hard to breathe through. The early gas masks were just cloth bags soaked in chemicals that you pulled over your head. Later, models were better, with actual filters, but they were still difficult to use. Soldiers would have to wear them for hours at a time, never knowing when the gas had dispersed enough to be safe. You couldn't eat or drink with a gas mask on. You could barely see through the fogged-up lenses. Communication was almost impossible because your voice was muffled. The fear of gas was constant. Every time you saw shells landing with soft pops instead of explosions, you'd panic that it might be gas. Every strange smell would make you reach for your gas mask. Some soldiers developed psychological reactions to gas attacks even when there was no gas. They'd start choking and gasping just from fear. The French had one major success in the early months, the recapture of Fort Douaumont. After the Germans captured it in February, the fort became a symbol of German victory and French humiliation. The French high command was obsessed with recapturing it. They launched several attacks through the spring and summer, but all of them failed with heavy casualties. The fort was too strong and the German defenders were too well prepared. Finally, on October 24, 1916, French colonial troops from Morocco launched a carefully planned attack and recaptured the fort. These were soldiers from French North Africa, tough, experienced fighters. The attack was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment that lasted several days. When the infantry advanced, they moved quickly and aggressively. The battle for the fort was vicious, fought room by room through the underground passages and on top of the fort structure. Both sides used flamethrowers and grenades in the tight spaces of the fort's interior. The fighting was hand-to-hand in many places. The tunnels and rooms were filled with smoke and fumes from explosions. Men fought in near-complete darkness, shooting at sounds and shadows. The French finally drove the Germans out after hours of intense combat, but the fort was so damaged it was barely recognizable. Shell fire had turned the massive concrete structure into a ruin. The interior was wrecked and filled with bodies. The recapture of Douaumont was celebrated in France as a great victory. Church bells rang across the country. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines. It was portrayed as revenge for the humiliation of losing the fort in February. But the reality was grimmer. The fort had changed hands, but at enormous cost. Thousands had died fighting over a pile of ruins that had lost most of its military value. It was symbolic, nothing more, but symbols mattered. The French needed victories, even small ones, to keep morale up and justify the horrific casualties. By June 1916, the Germans had shifted some of their attention away from Verdun. The British had launched their offensive on the Somme on July 1st, and Germany needed to send troops and resources there. The pressure on Verdun decreased, but the fighting never stopped. It continued through summer and fall. Attacks and counterattacks, more deaths, more destruction. The battle had taken on a life of its own. Neither side could stop without admitting failure. The Germans continued attacking, but with less intensity. They no longer had the resources to maintain the massive artillery bombardments of February and March. The French gradually pushed them back. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. Every meter of ground was fought over multiple times. Positions would change hands several times in a single day. By December, the French had recaptured most of the ground they'd lost. The front line was almost back where it had started in February. 10 months of fighting, 750,000 casualties, and the lines had barely moved. The battle officially ended on December 18, 1916. Both sides were exhausted. The Germans had failed to bleed France white. France had held. But France had paid a terrible price. Nearly every French soldier in the army passed through Verdun at some point during 1916. The rotation system meant that while individual units weren't destroyed, the trauma was spread across the entire French army. Every French family knew someone who had fought at Verdun. Every French soldier carried the psychological scars. Over 70 French divisions fought at Verdun at some point during the battle. That's roughly 1 million men who experienced the battle firsthand. They went home to every corner of France and carried their memories with them. Verdun became part of French national consciousness in a way few other battles have for any nation. It was France's defining moment in World War I. The Germans suffered almost as much as the French. Falkenhayn's plan to inflict unsustainable casualties on France had backfired because German casualties were just as high. The casualty ratio wasn't 2 or 3 to 1 in Germany's favor as Falkenhayn had predicted. It was roughly 1 to 1. Germany couldn't afford those losses any more than France could. Falkenhayn was fired in August 1916, partly because Verdun had failed to achieve its objectives. He'd promised to break France, and it failed. German morale suffered from the failure at Verdun just as French morale had suffered from the initial losses. The landscape around Verdun never recovered. The Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, is an area of approximately 460 square miles around Verdun and other battlefields where the contamination and damage is so severe that it's still restricted. Over 100 years later, the French government prohibits construction and agriculture in parts of the Zone Rouge. The soil is contaminated with lead, mercury, arsenic, and other toxic chemicals from millions of exploded shells. The contamination is so severe that it will take centuries for the soil to recover naturally. Unexploded ordnance is still being found constantly. French bomb disposal teams collect tons of unexploded shells every year from the Zone Rouge. These shells are still dangerous. They can still explode if disturbed. People still die occasionally when old shells explode during construction or farming. In 2014, 2 workers were killed when a shell they uncovered exploded. 100 years after the battle, Verdun is still killing people. The forests that have grown back in the Zone Rouge are strange. The trees grow twisted and stunted because the soil is so damaged. The roots can't grow properly through soil full of metal fragments and toxic chemicals. The ground is still covered with shell craters and the remains of trenches. You can walk through these forests and see the scars of the battle everywhere. Concrete bunkers slowly being swallowed by vegetation, rusted metal sticking up through the soil, fragments of equipment, and occasionally human remains that are still being discovered. Every year, hikers and forestry workers find bones. Sometimes complete skeletons are found in old bunkers or collapsed trenches. More often, it's just fragments: a skull, a femur, a handful of smaller bones. These remains are collected and sent to the Douaumont ossuary if they can't be identified. If they can be identified through remaining equipment or dog tags, the soldier can finally be properly buried over a century after his death. There's a memorial at Verdun called the Douaumont ossuary. It's a building that contains the bones of over 130,000 unidentified soldiers, French and German. These are the men whose bodies were found after the battle but couldn't be identified. Their bones were gathered from the battlefield and placed in the ossuary. The building is designed like a giant shell casing, or a sword buried point first in the ground, depending on your interpretation. You can look through small windows in the base of the building and see the bones. Piles of human bones, French and German mixed together, from men who killed each other over a few miles of dirt. Skulls and femurs and ribs and smaller bones, all jumbled together. The bones of enemies resting together in death. It's a powerful and disturbing sight. These were men who had names and families and lives, reduced to anonymous bones in a memorial. The psychological impact of Verdun on France was immense. The battle became a symbol of French determination and sacrifice. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass, became the rallying cry. This phrase was actually said by General Robert Nivelle, one of the commanders at Verdun, though it's often attributed to Pétain. It captured the French attitude perfectly. Germany would not pass through Verdun. France would hold no matter the cost. This became a core part of French national identity, but the cost was staggering. The French army was never the same after Verdun. The officers who had been willing to attack at any cost were mostly dead or discredited. The soldiers who survived were changed. They'd seen hell and survived it. They had less tolerance for incompetent leadership and pointless sacrifice. This would lead to mutinies in 1917, when French soldiers refused to participate in more suicidal attacks after another failed offensive under General Nivelle. The mutinies of 1917 were directly connected to Verdun. French soldiers had endured the horror of Verdun in 1916. They'd been promised it would lead to victory. Instead, the war dragged on. In 1917, Nivelle launched another offensive that failed with huge casualties. The soldiers had had enough. They didn't desert or go over to the enemy. They simply refused to attack. They'd defend their trenches, but they wouldn't participate in any more suicidal offensives. Over half the French army was affected by these mutinies to some degree. Pétain, who had saved Verdun, was brought in to restore order. He handled the mutinies carefully. He executed a few ringleaders to maintain discipline, but he also addressed the soldiers' concerns. He improved conditions, gave more leave, ensured better food and medical care, and stopped launching pointless attacks. The French army recovered, but it had changed. The soldiers had learned they could say no to their commanders, and the commanders had learned they couldn't just waste their men's lives. Pétain became a French hero after Verdun. He was seen as the general who cared about his soldiers and wouldn't waste their lives unnecessarily. This reputation carried him through the rest of the war and into the post-war period. He was celebrated as the Lion of Verdun, the man who had saved France. This made what happened later even more tragic. During World War II, when France was defeated by Germany in 1940, Pétain became the leader of Vichy France, the puppet French government that collaborated with Nazi Germany. The hero of Verdun became a traitor. He was put on trial after the war for collaboration and sentenced to death, though the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment because of his age and past service. He died in prison in 1951. His legacy was destroyed. The man who symbolized French resistance in 1916 became a symbol of French collaboration in 1940. For the Germans, Verdun was a failure and a trauma. They had attacked with the goal of destroying the French army, and they'd failed. They had suffered casualties just as severe as the French. The German soldiers who fought at Verdun were just as traumatized as the French. German accounts describe the same horror: the constant artillery, the bodies, the rats, the mud, the fear. One German soldier wrote, "Verdun transformed men into animals, and then it killed the animals." German casualty figures are disputed because their record-keeping was less complete than the French, but most historians estimate around 350,000 German casualties at Verdun, killed, wounded, and missing. This was roughly equal to French losses. The battle had become a mutual massacre, exactly what Falkenhayn had wanted to inflict on France, but Germany suffered equally. The failure at Verdun had strategic consequences for Germany. They had committed enormous resources to the battle and achieved nothing. The troops and artillery used at Verdun could have been used elsewhere. The failure damaged German morale and confidence in their high command. It also convinced some German leaders that the war in the West couldn't be won through attrition. This would eventually lead to different strategies: unrestricted submarine warfare to starve Britain, and support for revolution in Russia to knock Russia out of the war. Both sides used Verdun in their propaganda, but differently. The French emphasized their heroic defense. Posters showed French soldiers standing firm against German attacks. Newspapers wrote about the courage and sacrifice of the defenders. Verdun became proof that France could never be conquered, that French determination was unbreakable. This propaganda was important for maintaining civilian morale as the war dragged on. German propaganda downplayed Verdun and focused on other successes. They emphasized victories on other fronts and minimized the failure at Verdun. But German soldiers knew the truth. They'd been there. They knew the battle had been a disaster. The disconnect between what the propaganda said and what soldiers had experienced created cynicism and resentment toward their own leadership. After the war, German veterans wrote about Verdun with the same mixture of pride and horror as French veterans. Ernst Junger, a German writer who fought on the Western Front, described modern warfare as a monstrous steamroller that crushed everything in its path. German soldier memoirs from Verdun described the same experiences as French memoirs: the artillery, the death, the fear, the mud, and the impossibility of it all. They had all been through hell together, just on opposite sides. The battle also showed the limits of artillery as the decisive weapon. Both sides had believed that, with enough shells, they could destroy any defense. Verdun proved that wrong. Even after the most intense bombardments in history, defenders could survive in deep bunkers and fight back. Even after months of continuous shelling that turned the landscape into a cratered moonscape, soldiers on both sides continued fighting. The Germans fired an estimated 2 million shells in the first few days of the battle alone. If artillery bombardment could win battles by itself, Verdun should have fallen in the first week. But it didn't. The French defenders survived in underground bunkers and fought back. This should have been a lesson that artillery alone couldn't win battles. But it wasn't learned. The same tactics would be used on the Somme starting in July 1916, at Passchendaele in 1917, and in countless other battles. The generals kept believing that just a bit more artillery would finally break through. Verdun became the template for industrial warfare at its worst. It was war reduced to pure attrition. Not battles of maneuver or brilliant strategy, but simply trying to kill more of the enemy than he could kill of you. It was war as production. Produce more shells, produce more soldiers, produce more death than the other side. The side that could sustain the highest casualties would win. This was warfare reduced to its most brutal fundamentals. This was a fundamentally different kind of war from anything in history. In previous wars, battles lasted days or maybe weeks. Casualties were measured in thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Armies would maneuver, generals would use strategy and tactics to outthink their opponents. Napoleonic battles were often decided in a single day by a clever flanking maneuver or a well-timed cavalry charge. But at Verdun, none of that mattered. There was no room for maneuver. The front was locked in place. Strategy meant nothing when both sides were just throwing men and shells at each other. It was just endurance. Which side could endure the horror longer? The soldiers at Verdun knew this. They knew they were being fed into a machine that would chew them up. French soldiers going up to the front would say they were going to the mill or the mincer. Verdun was the machine that ground men into paste. They went anyway because what else could they do? Desert and be shot as a traitor? Refuse and be executed for cowardice? They went to Verdun, and to Verdun hoped they'd be one of the lucky ones who survived their rotation and got pulled out before being killed or wounded. Letters and diaries from Verdun survivors show men who had lost faith in their commanders, in the war, in any rational purpose behind the slaughter. One French soldier wrote, "We are not fighting anymore, we are being massacred. This is not war, this is extermination. Another wrote, "I don't know what we're fighting for anymore. I just want to survive long enough to go home." A German soldier wrote, "God has abandoned this place. Only the devil lives at Verdun now." But these same letters and diaries also show men who found meaning in protecting each other. The traditional bonds of unit cohesion and military discipline were weakened by the horror, but they were replaced by something else: a desperate mutual dependence. Soldiers would risk their lives to save wounded comrades. They'd share their rations with starving men. They'd hold each other when the shelling got too intense and men broke down crying. In the middle of industrial horror, human connections became even more important. Small acts of kindness and humanity stood out against the background of mass death. A soldier sharing his last cigarette with a friend. Men taking turns standing watch so others could sleep. Someone risking enemy fire to bring water to wounded men. These small acts of decency and care were how men maintained their humanity in an inhuman situation. They couldn't stop the battle or change the outcome, but they could help each other survive it. The medics at Verdun deserve special mention. They worked under impossible conditions, trying to save men who had catastrophic injuries. Wounds at Verdun were terrible because of the artillery. Men would have limbs torn off completely, massive holes blown in their bodies, faces destroyed beyond recognition, stomachs ripped open with intestines exposed, injuries that would be fatal even with modern medical care. The medics would try to stabilize them enough to get them evacuated to a field hospital, knowing most wouldn't make it. Many wounded men died before they could be evacuated. The process of moving wounded from the front lines to a field hospital could take hours or days. A man might lie in a shell hole for hours before stretcher bearers could reach him. Then he'd be carried back through trenches and communication trenches to a casualty clearing station, then loaded into an ambulance for transport to a field hospital. At each stage, men died from blood loss, shock, or their injuries worsening. The ones who made it to field hospitals often died later from infections. There were no antibiotics in 1916. Any wound that broke the skin could become infected. The dirt at Verdun was contaminated with bacteria from decomposing bodies, animal waste, and chemicals. Wounds became infected almost immediately. Surgeons would amputate damaged limbs to prevent gangrene from spreading, but often the infection had already entered the bloodstream and the soldier would die anyway from sepsis. Blood transfusions were new and risky. Blood typing was barely understood. Transfusions often failed or caused reactions that killed the patient. Storage of blood was primitive. There were no blood banks. Blood had to be donated on the spot when needed. Sometimes medics would give their own blood to wounded soldiers, then go back to work weakened from blood loss. Anesthesia was often unavailable at field hospitals close to the front. They didn't have enough supplies to anesthetize every patient. Surgeons had to decide who got anesthesia and who didn't. Men with less severe injuries might have to endure surgery while conscious, held down by other soldiers while doctors worked on them. The screaming from the operating areas was constant. Soldiers waiting for treatment could hear men screaming as surgeons amputated limbs or probed wounds. The hospitals behind the lines were overwhelmed. After major attacks, thousands of wounded men would arrive within hours. The medical staff would have to perform triage, deciding who might survive and who was beyond help. Men who were dying would be made as comfortable as possible with morphine and left to die so doctors could focus on men who might live. This triage system saved lives overall, but it meant watching men die who might have been saved in a better-equipped hospital with more time and resources. Medical personnel suffered psychological trauma, too. Doctors and nurses worked 18-hour shifts dealing with the worst injuries imaginable. They watched young men die by the hundreds. They had to make impossible decisions about who to treat and who to abandon. Many medical personnel developed their own versions of shell shock from the constant exposure to trauma and death. Some broke down completely and had to be relieved. Others became numb and detached, treating patients mechanically without emotional involvement because it was the only way to cope. Verdun also saw acts of incredible bravery on both sides that are mostly forgotten. Men who charged into machine gun fire to take an objective, knowing they probably wouldn't survive. Officers who led their men from the front and died doing it. One French officer, Lieutenant Colonel Driant, whom I mentioned earlier, became famous for his last stand on the first day of the battle. He commanded chasseur battalions in the Bois de Cour, one of the first areas hit by the German bombardment. Driant fought a delaying action for 2 days against overwhelming odds. His orders were to hold the position at all costs to buy time for reinforcements. He and his men fought until they ran out of ammunition and were surrounded. On February 22nd, while trying to organize a retreat of his surviving men, Driant was hit by machine gun fire. His last words reportedly were, "My mission is done. Look after my men." His body wasn't found until months later. He became one of the early martyrs of Verdun, a symbol of French determination to resist. There were countless other acts of bravery that went unrecorded. Medics who went into no man's land under fire to retrieve wounded men, runners who carried messages between units despite artillery fire and sniper bullets, machine gunners who held their positions alone against attacking infantry until they were killed, soldiers who threw themselves on grenades to save their comrades. These acts of courage happened every day at Verdun on both sides, but they're mostly forgotten because there were so many of them, and because the overall battle was so futile. One aspect often overlooked is the role of junior officers and NCOs at Verdun. Senior generals planned the battle and made strategic decisions, but junior officers and sergeants actually led men in combat. These were men in their 20s and 30s who had to lead soldiers under the worst possible conditions. They had to maintain discipline and morale when men were breaking down around them. They had to make split-second tactical decisions while being shelled and shot at. And they died in huge numbers. Junior officers had a much higher casualty rate than ordinary soldiers because they had to expose themselves to lead attacks. A lieutenant leading his platoon over the top would be a target for every German machine gunner and rifleman. Officers wore distinctive uniforms and insignia that made them easy to identify. Enemy forces would specifically target officers because killing them would disrupt the unit's leadership. Many junior officers at Verdun died within weeks or even days of arriving at the front. The French army had to constantly train new officers to replace the dead ones. Officer training schools worked around the clock to produce replacement officers. Many of these newly trained officers had only a few months of training before being sent to the front. They'd arrive at Verdun with theoretical knowledge, but no real combat experience, and they'd have to learn fast or die. The survival rate for new officers at Verdun was terrible. There were also moments of temporary humanity in the horror that showed how war can bring out both the worst and the best in people. Sometimes, both sides would observe informal truces to collect their wounded and dead. They'd stop firing for a few hours, and men would come out into no man's land to retrieve bodies and help wounded men. Soldiers from opposing sides would sometimes work near each other during these truces, both focused on the same grim task of collecting the dead. These truces weren't official. They were just soldiers on both sides recognizing their shared humanity and agreeing to pause the killing briefly. Sometimes men would exchange a few words or share cigarettes. They'd recognize that the enemy soldiers were just like them, ordinary men caught in a terrible situation. Then the truces would end, and they'd go back to trying to kill each other. But for a few hours, humanity would reassert itself. There are accounts of soldiers helping enemy wounded during these truces. A French soldier might help carry a wounded German back to German lines, or vice versa. The wounded man was no longer an enemy, just a suffering human being who needed help. These acts of mercy stood in stark contrast to the mechanical slaughter of the battle itself. The artillery crews on both sides had a different experience of the battle. They rarely saw the enemy or the effects of their fire. They'd fire their guns from miles behind the lines, aiming at map coordinates. For them, the war was an abstract problem of mathematics and logistics. Load the shell, aim the gun based on calculations, fire, adjust based on spotter reports, fire again. Hour after hour, day after day, the gunners would fire thousands of shells without ever seeing what happened when they landed. This psychological distance made it easier for artillery crews. They weren't killing people. They were just firing at targets. They didn't see the men they killed or the destruction they caused. This allowed them to continue functioning while inflicting massive casualties. It's easier to kill when you don't have to see the results. This would become increasingly true in modern warfare. The further you are from the killing, the easier it becomes psychologically. But for the infantry in the trenches, there was no such distance. They saw everything. They saw their friends die. They saw the enemy up close. They saw the results of artillery fire, the torn bodies, the destroyed landscape. They couldn't abstract the war into numbers and coordinates. It was visceral and immediate and impossible to escape mentally. By the end of the battle, in December 1916, both armies were exhausted. The Germans had given up trying to take Verdun. They didn't officially admit defeat. They just stopped attacking. The French had given up trying to push the Germans back significantly beyond their original positions. They'd recaptured most of the lost ground, including Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux, another major fort that had fallen to the Germans in June, but neither side had the strength to continue. The battle just ended because both sides couldn't continue anymore. There was no dramatic final battle or decisive moment. It just slowly wound down until it stopped. The last major attacks happened in mid-December, and then the fighting diminished to regular trench warfare. Raids, patrols, artillery exchanges, but no major offensives. The battle was over, not because anyone had won, but because both sides were too exhausted to go on. The statistics are mind-numbing. 300,000 dead, 450,000 wounded, 750,000 casualties total, roughly equal between France and Germany. These numbers are estimates because the actual counts were impossible. Too many bodies were never found or identified. Some estimates go even higher, suggesting over 1 million total casualties when you include men who went missing and were never found. To put that in perspective, the entire battle was fought over a front about 20 miles wide and maybe 10 miles deep. 750,000 casualties in an area of roughly 200 square miles. That's over 3,000 casualties per square mile. The density of death at Verdun was unlike anything the world had seen. More men died per square mile at Verdun than in almost any other battle in history. And what did all those deaths accomplish? Militarily, nothing. The front lines ended roughly where they started. Neither side gained any significant advantage. The Germans held some ground on the east bank of the Meuse River, but it wasn't strategically important. France retained control of Verdun City and most of the fortress system. Strategically, Verdun tied up resources that both sides needed elsewhere, but it didn't change the overall course of the war. The Western Front remained deadlocked. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years after Verdun ended. But Verdun's importance wasn't military. It was symbolic and psychological. For France, Verdun proved they could withstand anything Germany threw at them. They had held the line against the most intense assault in history. They had refused to break. This was enormously important for French morale and national identity. France could hold its head up and say they had stopped Germany's best effort to destroy them. This belief sustained France through the remaining years of the war. For Germany, Verdun was a warning that victory in the West might be impossible. They had thrown enormous resources at the battle. Millions of shells, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, months of continuous effort and failed to achieve their objective. This planted doubts in German strategic thinking. If they couldn't bleed France to death at Verdun, how could they win the war? This doubt would influence German strategy for the rest of the war, leading to decisions like unrestricted submarine warfare and efforts to knock Russia out of the war first. For the soldiers on both sides, Verdun represented the ultimate nightmare of modern war. It was everything terrible about World War I, concentrated in one place and extended for 10 months. If you survived Verdun, you had survived the worst. Veterans of Verdun had a special status among soldiers. They had been through hell and come out the other side. Other soldiers would recognize Verdun veterans and treat them with a mixture of respect and pity. They had seen and survived something that others could barely imagine. French soldiers developed a dark saying, "They're not sending us to Verdun, they're sending us to be killed at Verdun." This reflected their understanding, that Verdun was less a battle than an execution. You went there, you endured it for your rotation period, and you hoped you'd be lucky enough to leave alive. There was no glory in it, no sense of heroism or adventure. It was just survival. The French built massive cemeteries around Verdun after the war, rows and rows of white crosses stretching as far as you can see. Each one represents a dead soldier. The French National Cemetery at Douaumont contains over 16,000 graves. The German cemetery at Haumont-Près-Saint-Monieux contains over 12,000 graves. There are several other cemeteries in the area, each with thousands of graves. French, German, colonial troops from France's empire. They're all buried there. The cemeteries are maintained by the French and German governments as memorials. They're carefully kept up. The grass is mowed, the crosses are maintained, flowers are planted. People still visit them today, over 100 years later. Tourists come to see the battlefield. School groups come to learn about the war. Descendants of soldiers who fought there come to see where their grandfathers or great-grandfathers died. The battlefield itself is a memorial. The French government has preserved parts of the battlefield as they were after the war. You can walk through it and see the preserved trenches, the ruined forts, the shell craters. The ground is still pocked with craters even after a century. Some trenches have been rebuilt to show what they look like. Bunkers and fortifications remain, slowly crumbling but still recognizable. Fort Douaumont is open to visitors. You can walk through the underground passages where men fought and died. The fort is cold and dark and cramped. You can see where shells penetrated the concrete walls. You can see the room where a massive explosion killed hundreds of German soldiers in May 1916. A fire spread to ammunition stores and caused a catastrophic explosion that entombed over 600 men. Their bodies were never recovered. They're still in there, sealed in the fort. It's a sobering experience, standing in these places where men died over a century ago. The battlefield has an atmosphere that's hard to describe. A heaviness, a sense of lingering trauma. Some visitors report feeling overwhelmed by sadness or dread. Whether that's the psychological weight of knowing what happened there or something more is open to interpretation. But, walking through the Verdun battlefield, you're constantly reminded that you're walking on ground where hundreds of thousands of men died. Verdun changed how people thought about war in fundamental ways. Before World War I, many people in Europe thought war was glorious and honorable. Soldiers would fight bravely. Victories would be won through courage and determination, and everyone would come home heroes. War was portrayed in art and literature as a noble endeavor, a test of national character and opportunity for men to prove their courage. Verdun shattered that romantic view of war completely. It showed that modern war was none of those things. It was industrial slaughter on a scale never before seen. It was mud and blood and rats and madness. It was young men dying in holes in the ground for no purpose they could understand. It was being blown apart by shells fired from miles away by gunners who never saw their targets. It was random death that could strike anyone at any moment regardless of courage or skill. This realization spread through European society after the war. The lost generation of writers and artists who had fought in the war tried to express what they'd experienced. They wrote poems and books and painted pictures trying to capture the horror. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front described the psychological destruction of young soldiers. Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen wrote poems about the waste and futility of the war. These works helped create a cultural understanding that the Great War had been a catastrophic waste of human life. Nothing really worked. You can't fully convey what Verdun was like to someone who wasn't there. Language fails when trying to describe that level of horror sustained for that length of time. But these writers and artists tried, and their work helped shape public memory of the war. The image of World War I as a pointless slaughter comes largely from these post-war cultural works, many of which drew specifically on experiences at Verdun. The pacifist movements that emerged in the 1920s and 1930s drew heavily on memories of Verdun and other World War I battles. People looked at the casualty lists and the devastated landscapes and said, "Never again." They swore there would never be another war like that. Peace movements gained strength. People wanted disarmament. They wanted international cooperation to prevent future wars. The League of Nations was created partly in response to the horror of World War I. They were wrong. World War II was even worse in many ways. More people died. More civilians were targeted. The Holocaust added genocide to the list of horrors. Atomic weapons made annihilation possible. But the impulse was understandable. Having seen what modern war looked like, many people wanted to avoid it at all costs. The policy of appeasement toward Nazi Germany in the 1930s was partly driven by the memory of World War I. British and French leaders remembered the trenches and were desperate to avoid another war, even if it meant making concessions to Hitler. But here's the thing that haunts me most about Verdun. All that death, all that suffering, all that sacrifice, and nothing changed. The war continued. The same strategies were used again and again. The Somme offensive started while Verdun was still going on. The same kind of massed attacks against prepared defenses, the same reliance on artillery, the same horrific casualties for minimal gains. Passchendaele in 1917 was another Verdun. Men fighting in mud and dying by the tens of thousands for meaningless objectives. More battles like Verdun happened throughout the war. More men died in the same pointless ways. The generals and politicians who ordered men into the meat grinder at Verdun didn't learn from it. They just did it again somewhere else. The lessons that should have been learned: that artillery alone can't win battles, that frontal attacks against machine guns and barbed wire are suicidal, that the defensive advantage is too strong to overcome with current tactics. These lessons were ignored. The soldiers knew it was futile. They wrote about it in letters and diaries. They knew they were being wasted. But they kept fighting because they didn't have a choice, and they kept dying because that's what the war machine demanded. It needed fuel, and the fuel was human lives. Verdun consumed 750,000 lives, and the war machine was still hungry for more. The Somme, Passchendaele, and the German Spring Offensive of 1918, all of them consumed more lives in the same way. This is why Verdun matters today. Not because it changed anything. It didn't. Not because great strategies were employed or great generals proved themselves. They weren't, and they didn't. Verdun matters because it shows us what happens when human beings build machines for killing and then feed other human beings into those machines. It shows us the logical endpoint of industrial warfare, the complete subordination of human life to military objectives, where men become nothing more than numbers in casualty reports. And the scariest part? We didn't learn. The same thing happened again in World War II, sometimes on even larger scales. The siege of Stalingrad had echoes of Verdun, months of fighting over a symbolic city, hundreds of thousands of casualties, neither side willing to give up. Modern wars continue to show the same patterns. military objectives taking priority over human life, civilians caught in the killing, wars that drag on long past any rational purpose. We're still building bigger and better machines for killing. We're still willing to sacrifice lives for political goals or territorial gains or resources or ideology. Verdun should have taught us that modern warfare is too destructive, too costly in human terms, to be worth it. But here we are, over 100 years later, and wars continue. Different weapons, different tactics, but the same fundamental reality. Human beings killing each other while politicians and generals make decisions from safety. The ground at Verdun is still poisoned. Tests show high levels of lead, mercury, zinc, and arsenic in the soil. The decomposition of millions of shells and the explosion of chemical weapons left the soil toxic. Crops grown in the Zone Rouge often absorb these toxins. That's why agriculture is still prohibited in many areas. The contamination will persist for centuries more before the soil naturally cleanses itself. The forests are still twisted. If you know what to look for, you can identify trees in the Zone Rouge by their growth patterns. They're stunted and deformed because their roots can't grow properly through contaminated, metal-filled soil. The ecosystem itself is damaged in ways that will take generations more to heal, if it ever fully does. The bones are still being found. In 2014, French archaeologists discovered a shelter that had collapsed during the battle with 21 German soldiers inside. Their remains had been there for 98 years. In 2016, on the 100th anniversary of the battle, remains of 9 French soldiers were found. In 2018, more remains were discovered. This continues every year. Every time there's construction or forestry work in the area, there's a chance of finding more bones. Over 100 years later, Verdun is still giving up its dead. The battle isn't really over. Its effects linger in the contaminated soil, the twisted forests, the bones that keep emerging from the ground. The trauma passed down through generations of French and German families who lost ancestors there. The memories preserved in monuments and museums and books, the psychological legacy of a battle that became a symbol of industrialized horror. Hell on earth. That's what Verdun was. 300 days of continuous fighting. 2 million men thrown into a meat grinder. 750,000 casualties. An entire landscape destroyed. And nothing to show for it except more dead bodies and more trauma. The front lines ended up where they started. No strategic advantage was gained. No war aims were achieved. Just death on an industrial scale, sustained for 10 months, and then it stopped, not because anyone won, but because both sides were too exhausted to continue. That's the reality of Verdun. That's the done story that needs to be told. Not sanitized history about strategies and generals, but the truth about what happened to human beings in that hellscape. The mud and the blood and the rats, the constant terror of artillery, the random death, the bodies you couldn't bury, the smell you couldn't escape, the psychological damage that never healed, the absolute futility of it all. Verdun stands as a warning from history about what happens when we let war consume us, when we prioritize military objectives over human life, when we feed human beings into machines designed to kill them efficiently, when we let pride and nationalism override basic humanity. Verdun is what war really looks like when you strip away the propaganda and the glory in the noble rhetoric. It's hell on earth, and we should never forget it. Subscribe for more untold stories from history's darkest chapters.